The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Dominic Frisby, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello and welcome to the Gold Money Podcast, hosted in association with Frisby's Bulls and Bears, with me, Dominic Frisby. Martín Von Hildebrand is the director of Fundación Gaia Amazonas, an organisation which he set up in 1990 to work with the indigenous people of the Amazon area in Colombia, to help them secure their territorial rights and to protect the forest. He first visited the Amazonian Indians in the 1970s and has ever since been an activist for indigenous rights, cultural and ecological diversity, working in both government and non-government organisations. In 1986 he became head of indigenous affairs under the government of Virgilio Barco, and now some 246,000 square kilometres of Colombian Amazon territory have been officially handed back to the local indigenous inhabitants. He has a doctorate in ethnology from the Sorbonne in Paris and has won many awards, including the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship in 2009. Martin, thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview. You're sitting in your offices in Bogota. I'm in London. A lot of my listeners are very interested in gold and in gold mining in particular. So why don't we start with the problem of illegal mining in the Amazon? What goes on there and what kind of damage is it doing? Not just environmental damage, but also social damage.
Well, thank you for this interview. Yes, well, the gold in the Amazon, there is a lot of gold and a lot of coltan, that is this metal that we use for our cell phones. And there wasn't so many, the problem wasn't so great a few years ago because, ironically, the presence of the gorilla there kept everybody out. But now, since things have become, in a sense, better, there's less gorilla, in another sense, there's been a rush for gold. And there are a lot of people, adventurers, that go in there and it's all illegal. The government so far has not given any permissions to exploit the gold in the Colombian Amazon. But there are a lot of illegal miner people, not minor exploiters in mining, and they come from Brazil and from Colombia. A lot come from Brazil, also the famous garimpeiros. Now the problem there is, on the one hand, there isn't enough control, and not only because there isn't an institutional capacity, but because the laws are not clear enough to be able to control. That is, that if somebody asks for a permit for mining, which might take years to get, you might send in a letter to the government. When the police come along and say, "What are you doing here? You don't have a permit," and he says, "Yes, but it's already in the government. It's coming out any day." And they manage one way or another to play around, to beat around the bush with this. Now, it's because it is very far in the Amazon where there are no roads, no communication, even radio communication is difficult. So all becomes a bit more flexible in that sense.
Okay, are we talking about artisanal miners or are we talking about kind of big firms?
Neither. Artisanal miners for us would mean people that have a long tradition in mining. And in that sense, it's not. It's very recent, and there are local people that it's local mining, of course, but they've come from abroad, that is either from Brazil or from the Andes in Colombia. It is not the local people. So it's artisanal in the sense that it is small mining, but it uses mercury and it pollutes the water and it does a lot of damage. But it is not artisanal in the sense it is not a traditional mining, small traditional mining.
I understand. And are these kind of groups of one or two people, or is it groups of kind of, 10, 15 or 20?
No, generally it's families or 2 or 3 people with their families. They might add up to 10 or 12 on a raft, and they're going along, and it's set on the big rivers, and they have a kind of an enormous vacuum cleaner which sucks the sand out, and then they look through this sand, they put it through sieves, and they extract the gold. And they use mercury, of course, to attract the gold.
Well, why don't you tell us about the damage that mercury does and what it does to the local people?
Well, the problem with mercury, it affects the brain, but the problem of it is that it accumulates. So if the if it goes into the plants and then the fish eat the plants and then the humans eat the mercury, it doesn't dissolve. So it accumulates and it goes straight through this chain, through the plants, through the fish, into the human beings, and it attacks the brain. I don't know in detail from a medical point of view exactly what the effect is on the brain, no, but I know it is very negative.
Yeah, it sends you mad.
Yeah.
Okay, now, I mean, presumably, are you aware of there's a phrase among economists called the tragedy of the commons, which is that when nobody owns the fish, so nobody has an interest in looking after the fish, and as a result, nobody looks after the fish stocks. When you've got people coming from outside, operating in an area that, is not theirs, perhaps they don't operate in a way that respects the environment and conserves the environment in an ideal fashion. Is that a dynamic that's occurring?
Definitely, because the indigenous people that own the land in this area, well, they take care of the animals and of the plants, not only take care of them not in the same way as we do, but since they consider themselves part of the environment, that if the environment is ill or has problems, the human beings will also be ill, and also have problems. So their whole shamanistic approach is to keep the environment healthy. So they have a long tradition, according to archaeological data, they've been here in the area for about 9,000 to 10,000 years. So they have a very intimate knowledge of the forest and the environment, and they take care of it. There used to be 7 times more indigenous people in this area than there are nowadays. Wherever you go in the forest, to the last corner of the forest, you'll dig and you'll find ceramics. They've been all over the place, and yet the forest is there, it's intact. Whereas these people are not interested in the forest, they're interested in making money.
Yeah. Okay, now, you've described the area as, I mean, it must be virtually impossible to police. There's no roads. I mean, you're talking about an enormous area here. If there's metal in the ground, somebody's going to mine it. So how do you police this area? How do you put a stop to this irresponsible mining?
Well, the first thing, there are 2 levels of this. On the one hand, the government has to be clear if it wants to preserve the environment or if it wants to exploit the subsoil. Because the Indians, the indigenous people, own the land and everything above the land. But the subsoil belongs to the nation and therefore it's administered by the state and the government. So the state or the government has to decide exactly which way it's going, if it's going to exploit the subsoil or it's going to protect the environment. That's the first thing that is not clear enough in the government so far. The rules of the game aren't clear. What's going to happen with the Amazon? Although it's not that easy to get in there and exploit it because the indigenous people, you have to go across their territory and they won't agree because all the soil is sacred from their point of view and you should not extract gold or any other product from the subsoil. As for the policing, it's difficult because it's enormous, but on the other hand, there are only 5 or 6 airports to get in there. So if you control the airports properly, you can control all the access of food, petrol or gasoline, motors, equipment. So it's not that difficult. It's lack of clarity in the norms and lack of a political clarity, a policy. There's a lack of clear policies.
Controlling the food and other supplies sounds horrendous to me. I mean, how would you do that? With some kind of customs or something? Or
Exactly. Well, it flies in with the airplane a certain amount of food, and they have to bring in the gasoline, and they have to bring in the products. Now, when the indigenous need things, well, they go and they buy them on one knows, but one also knows perfectly well, it's pretty obvious. If they're bringing in certain types of motors and certain types of large amounts of food and things like that, well, one can control. Well, they know who's coming in and where the products are going because there aren't that many inhabitants. We're talking of a territory, if we look at the whole Indian territory, the size of the United Kingdom, and we're talking about of less than 100,000 people living in this area, and it's spread out through this large area. So it's not that difficult to know what's going where and to keep an eye on that.
Do some of the Indians actually want mining in the area?
Yes, well, you do find in the northern part where there is more mining, in fact, they are more interested. The more traditional the people are, the less they want mining. The more they have become integrated into the Western society and are consuming products from our society, the more interested they are in mining, especially the young people. The elders, not that much, because they're more traditional, and there's still certain groups that are very traditional. But there are other groups that even have changed their traditional values and become evangelic, and therefore the sacred sites don't exist anymore, etc.
Now, you talked about the two forms of ownership: the ownership of the forest and the ownership of the subsoil. If a company came in and it planned to, mine responsibly in the area. In other words, it used modern practices. It didn't use mercury. It brought employment to the Indians, and the Indians actually wanted it. Is that something you'd oppose, or is that something you'd be in favour of?
I think that it's. I wouldn't say I'm in favour of that. And I wouldn't oppose it either. I would consult with the indigenous people. I would see how the standards were going to be carried out. I see how the work was going to be done. And I think that it is inevitable that in certain areas there will be mining. I mean, it's difficult for us to say no mining at all when we live in a society that uses the products of mining all the time. Well, it depends what's going to be mining, what is the impact, what do the indigenous people say, if it is in a place where there's sacred sites. All these conditions have to be analysed before one could say yes or no. But certainly, if the indigenous people said, sorry, but this is a territory, our ancestral territory, and it's sacred, well, it would be definitely no. And if it also affected the ecosystems, definitely not. But otherwise, I think one should sit down and analyse it.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible for mining to have beneficial effects if it's done properly.
Our problem is, there are two problems there. It's not so much for the local people and employment, because most of these indigenous people have income one way or another. That is, they produce their own food, and there's education and health programs from the government that put money, and their main problem is not money, although a bit more money wouldn't do them, perhaps they would consider wouldn't do them any harm. It's not their main problem. There are two problems. One, that this represents 1/3 or a bit less than 1/3 of the country, and is the government willing to say, I'll leave this aside and get no income from 1/3 of the country? Or would there be an alternative that we're paid for environmental services and then we have an income? But the government as such would say, it's a large piece of land, as I said, the size of the United Kingdom, what income can we obtain from that territory? It's not only an indigenous problem, it's a national problem. And the second thing is that we use the mining, and if certain products of mining are necessary to extract, well, it's a complicated discussion to say no to mining totally unless there are strong environmental or cultural arguments.
Okay. I'm kind of detecting a certain amount of frustration on your behalf with the government. Is that right?
Yes, there's a frustration because there are no clear policies of how things should be done. So we've managed to open certain gaps there where we've managed to tell the government no mining so far until all the studies, environmental and cultural studies, have been properly carried out. And so for 2 years there will be no mining, and we're working on that to try and get the studies, the information, and get the indigenous people on board so they can also say what they want and what thing to do. But the policies are weak, yes, there is a certain frustration.
What kind of development would you like to see go on? I mean, do you want the Indian people to, I mean, it's more about what they want rather than what you want, but I mean, do you want the Indian people to stay as they are, or do you want them to kind of integrate gradually into the modern world? I mean, what would you like to see happen in terms of their evolution?
Well, I would like to see the indigenous people keeping their identity, keeping their self-confidence, and keeping a lot of their own criteria and values, but taking from our modern society, taking what they consider necessary. I would not that keen on them integrating directly, on the one hand, because generally the opportunities we have in our society are very few. I don't think that we have the best solutions for society nor for the environment. So I don't think that at this stage, when we see problems of climate change, when we see problems of the crisis in Europe, when we see so many economic and social and environmental problems integrating to our society, I don't think is the best solution. But at the same time, all societies change and evolve. So they will take a lot of elements. So right now with the traditional groups we work with, they're already handling computers. Obviously they're They're writing projects, they're getting certain support for certain programs they develop, particularly for their own internal research. The thing we encourage a lot is that they do research with the elders on their traditional knowledge, on the environment, on their society, on their culture, because this strengthens their identity, and we are rescuing 10,000 years of, or to an extent, 10,000 years of knowledge. I mean, all this that has never been written down is something that should be brought out by them and written up by them.
Okay. Now, I think I know I am, and I think a lot of listeners to this program have a very libertarian stance in that they've lost faith in governments. They don't think governments are doing a good job in the United States. They don't think government is doing a good job in Europe, and they're in favour of small government and individual responsibility. And so we perhaps put the argument forward that the best way for the natives to develop is not through some kind of government planning, but it's best that they do it through their own empowerment. And, you know, the wealth that can be derived from mining, as I say, if it's done responsibly, it might be one way in which they can do that.
Yes, but the point is that to begin with, the indigenous people, when they're traditional, particularly, as I said, consider the earth is sacred and what's below the earth, and it's very logical what they're saying. As the planet Earth evolved, things were put, that is, they considered Mother Earth, but things were put away because they were not good for the life as we were going to live it, as human beings were going to live it. That's why the oil and the gold, everything was put away, because that was not the right thing for us to have. It would not help us in our daily lives. And so they say what was put under the earth in the evolution of the earth, if we wish to call it like that, should remain there, and we should live what's on top of the earth. Now, there's a certain logic in that. And so this is sacred. So they're not that keen on mining, and they don't like mining as such, and they are aware of the pollution that it causes, plus generally, unless it's properly done, there's alcoholism and prostitution and
Yes, yeah.
Over hunting and taking all the animals, and everybody starts killing all the animals to sell them for the food of the people that are mining, and it creates several problems. So they're not keen on that, and they know that since the government is very weak and does not have the capacity, institutional capacity, to control proper mining, they say any mine that will come in will be negative. It's not like mining that you get in countries like Europe. There is no control here, or very little control. Yeah. So they are against mining, and they have alternatives. I mean, for instance, they have medicinal plants which they could also try and put on the market. And if there's any value sooner or later on keeping the forest on without cutting it down, the standing forest, and you would have carbon that is accumulated in the trees, etc. There could be other ways of looking for an income for these people who don't need a large income because they already have a fair income that comes through, as I say, governmental programs such as education and health, and there's a need for a certain amount of money, but it's not like us.
Woe betide anyone who relies on the government for its income, because that way the zombie lies.
I agree, but I mean there's certain things that, like education, the government has to give education, and what we've managed there, what they've managed was our support, is that they set up their own programs, they run their own programs, they pay for their teachers, etc. The same thing in health. And so they receive the income for that. And then they set up the local programs, they decide their territorial management, and they produce their own food, they have their own houses, they make their canoes. So one way or another, I mean, if we were all to disappear, I think they would survive. No, I think they're still very independent in that sense.
A potential solution that's forming in my mind as I talk to you, Martin, is there's a big difference, of course, between actual mining, when you build a great big open pit mine or an underground mine, whatever it is, and simple exploratory drilling. And to me, yes, it makes sense. I mean, exploratory drilling is sticking a drill, you know, and the width of the drill bit is, you know, it's not much bigger than the width of your hand.
Yeah.
And, you know, so that does very little damage. It kind of would make sense to have some exploratory drilling, work out where the gold actually is, and then go from there.
I think it's a question of standards and of technology. I agree with you. in principle, obviously, I'm not that keen on mining in the area at all, if that were possible from many points of view. But if it's going to come in, we have to choose the right places, the right technology, and the right standards to make sure, and the right control to make sure that the negative impact is minimum.
Yeah. Now, what kind of networks and strategies do you have in place to stop what you consider the wrong sort of development happening in the area?
Well, what we have been working on and dealing both with the indigenous people and the government is to open spaces where the indigenous people can make their decisions and can decide what type of government, how they want to run the situation. For instance, to give an example, when you mentioned at the beginning, we managed that the land was turned over to the Indians, the property of the land in a collective way. It's a collective property. It's inalienable. Nobody can take it away from them. It's in the Constitution, and they own the territory the size of the United Kingdom. But that's our point of view, that they own it. When I started talking with them and said, look, we must get these papers because you must show that you own the land. They said, we don't own the land. The land belongs to the animals, to the birds, to the rivers. We don't own the land. We belong to the land. So the concept of ownership is different. So the way I see it is open spaces by giving them land or setting up that they can set up their education, but mainly keep away the encroachment of the Western world. Give them a space to think and to find out the best way of doing things. We obviously will give them information and knowledge which they would need to make their decisions, and let them decide which way they want to go and articulate with the outside world, with our world, but on their terms, and give them enough time. Recognize that this will take a bit of time. But it is not so much us going in there and find the best solution. It's discussing with them and with them build a solution that comes from them and obviously is articulated with our thinking and our way of life because they belong to this world. They're already articulated with our world. But it's opening these spaces which I think is necessary. So when you talk about the mining, what we've done is work with them. They've done the studies of their territories. They're setting up all the systems of sacred sites. We've spoken with the government, no mining until the indigenous people can define their territories. And we try and work it out like that on their indigenous knowledge, on biological knowledge also of the environment, and setting up platforms, discussing with the government to come to agreements where there'll be no mining unless it really does a minimum of damage, no?
Okay. And that's no exploration either?
No exploration, nothing. Hands off until we have enough knowledge to make sure that we're not doing a major damage.
That's going to take years.
Well, we've been working years. We've worked 20 years from a cultural point of view, from environmental, and I think one can move depending on the area. Well, yes, one area after the other will take years. We should have to start. We'll see.
No, I mean, it'll take years before any mining can happen. That's what I meant.
We'll see. Anyway, yes, the government has agreed to 10 years, which is not bad.
Okay. And what other networks do you have in place? I mean, presumably you rely on funding. What happens if your funding dries up?
Well, that's a major problem, and it does happen because our funding has all come from the European governments, fundamentally, and from the European Union or the Commission. That's what our funding, but now in the present situations, it's not coming in anymore. And we've looked to the United States. A certain amount of funding comes from the United States, but it's a different approach towards funding. No, it's not long-term, it's or short-term, more immediate impact. It's more along the social entrepreneur approach than on the social movements approach, which the European was more long-term. So we're adapting, but obviously it's been difficult.
So the EU has stopped funding you altogether, has it?
No, it hasn't. They simply had calls, and we always submitted projects to the calls. But last year it didn't have a call, and this year nothing has come out. So it's not directly with us. It's simply that they are not. They don't have these calls to fund. Yeah.
Okay.
To fund projects, right? They're not calling projects.
Oh, okay. So and what happens? When you're doing something, you're effectively trying to stop people doing something. That never ends, does it? At what point do you say Gaia has achieved its goals? Now we move on. When do you stop?
Well, you see, we stop with certain things. For instance, we say their land, the management of the lands to a large extent, the primary education and health. Well, that works pretty well. That's sustainable. The dollars with the government, decentralization, that works, fair enough. Now suddenly, as I mentioned, in the last 2 or 3 years, there's a rush on mining. So now we look into the mining. So there's certain steps that we have already achieved, or they have achieved with our support, and that works, and we keep a minimum of presence along that. We just might go in and give them a hand, because they'll always need, like all societies and all communities need a certain advice as things change in the world in education and health and economy, this and that, the other. But it already works. That is operating in health, education, and the management of the territories and the local governments. Now, other things come up, like the mining, and then there might be other problems that will come up. And with climate change, there'll be new problems. So they'll always need outsiders. Now, the other thing that we do in Gaia, we're getting them other allies. So it's not only Gaia that they might have to depend on, but they can also work with, let's say, with universities and with other institutions that have a permanent income and a more stable, and they can count on, because they'll always need it. As we will need them, they will need us in protecting the environment and in protecting cultural diversity.
Okay, and last question for you, Martin, and forgive me, I've got two final questions for you, but were you how did you, did the Indians kind of choose you to act on their behalf? Did they kind of elect you, or, how did that happen? Or did you kind of say, look, did you kind of volunteer yourself?
Well, I went in 1972 for the first time, and I went in more just to learn about their cultures, and they were still in rubber camps and being exploited as more or less like slaves, and they had absolutely no rights whatsoever. And I lived with them in the 70s and discussed this, and that's where we decided to try and get the land rights recognized, and to try and change the education of missionaries that were taking their children away and teaching them not to be Indians, and to recuperate the control over their territories. And I lived with them in the 70s, and then the 80s I was in government, and I managed to get several jobs in government, which allowed me to push this agenda ahead. And at the end of the 80s, in the 90s, beginning of the 90s, I went back to accompany the indigenous people to put all this into practice. So I can't say I represent them or that they chose me to represent them. I've accompanied them. I've been with them, and of course they trust me because they know me, and I've always come back and always been there. And fortunately, most of the decisions have worked in the right direction, and we have results. And so so there's enormous trust. And I sit with their elders now, and they call me grandfather, and that's the role I play with them. Yeah.
Okay, and is drug trafficking a problem in the area?
Drug trafficking is a problem, but not necessarily in the area. It happens. It goes up and down rivers in a discreet way, but there is no fighting, there is no production, they don't cultivate it, there are no laboratories. It is just a path, and there's no fighting over those rivers. So it does happen over the border, but it is not something that affects the area in a negative or positive way.
Okay. All right. Well, Martin, thank you so much for doing this interview. To me, it seems that a little bit of exploratory drilling is the solution. Find out where the gold is, and then you can, where there isn't any gold, you've got nothing to worry about.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'd lobby them to allow some exploration.
As long as one can control it and it doesn't get out of hand.
Well, there's nothing. Exploration is simply exploration. Yeah. You're not actually mining anything. So.
Oh, well, you don't have to do it anymore. They're doing it right now. You fly at 100 meters above in an airplane, and doing it right now, and you can detect everything from the air.
Yeah, no, but you still need to drill. You still need to drill.
In certain places, but
the flying over is just the preliminary stages.
Mm. Anyway, that's what they're up to now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Martin Van Hildebrand, why don't you give out your website address so that people can find out more about your work and what you do?
Okay, so it's Gaia Amazonas, in one word, Gaia Amazonas, was 2 A's in the middle, .org. www.gaiaamazonas.org.
Okay, and I'll put out a link on the homepage. That's gaiaamazonas.org. Martin Von Hildebrand, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dominic. Bye-bye.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.